host of this event, which is the Ambassador of New Zealand in Italy. So please, Ambassador, welcome.
Thank you. Good morning, and thank you to everyone who has come along today. First, I'd like to, first of all, my name is Antony Simpson. I'm the Ambassador of New Zealand to the Italian Republic. I've been here since about 2019. I should apologize first for two things. One is that I'm not there with you in person. I had intended to be. Unfortunately, I had close contact with a COVID positive individual at the beginning of last week, and so I'm in precautionary self-isolation. In the diplomatic world, it's considered a very, very bad thing to infect a room full of strangers with a deadly disease. So unfortunately, I couldn't take the risk of coming there and being with you in person. But I'm really happy that I get a chance to talk to you, at least virtually, and I hope in the future I'll have a chance to meet with some of you in person, perhaps on another occasion. The second thing I should say is I'm very grateful for you letting me conduct this question and answer in English. I speak a little bit of Italian, but it is really not very good. So this would be a very strange and confusing discussion if we were to do this in Italian. But I do have a slightly unusual accent. The New Zealand accent is not very well known and not very familiar, I expect, for most of you. So I hope that I'm not too difficult to understand in what I'm saying. The topic that I wanted to talk about today is trade policy. I know that may not be the most exciting topic for many of you. Indeed, when I was a student, when I was at university like you, I didn't think that I would be joining the foreign ministry to talk about trade. It was not a topic that interested me very much, to be honest. But since taking on my job as a diplomat, I discovered two things. One is that as a New Zealand diplomat, you cannot have a career without talking about trade. Trade is so fundamental to our relationships and our interests that you need to know about it and you need to talk about it. But secondly, I learned that trade is a really, really important issue. It touches on so many aspects of life and of the kind of world we want to live in. And trade rules specifically really matter. So I think, I hope that this discussion will be reasonably interesting to you, and I'll try to make it interesting. At the end of this, we'll have a chance to talk and to have some questions and answers. They don't all have to be about trade. I'm really happy to talk about anything else that's interesting to you. But perhaps if at least one person could ask a question about trade, so I know that someone was listening at least. So why don't I start then? I want to talk to you about trade because, as I said, I believe that trade policy and good trade policy really matters. But as you probably know, trade policy can be a very divisive topic. If you ask any group of people whether they think trade is good or bad, you'll get quite a range of answers. Some people will tell you, probably the economists, that trade is inherently good and positive. Some other people will tell you that it is a driver of exploitation and inequality. And these views will often be very strongly held and quite passionately expressed. Today, I want to talk to you about New Zealand's views on trade policy and why we hold those views. Because, and this may surprise you, but New Zealand has been one of the strongest and most consistent advocates for open global trade policies and for a rules-based global trading system. Our foreign ministry has invested very, very heavily in trade policy, both at the World Trade Organization, the WTO, and in pursuing individual free trade agreements, FTAs. The reason, perhaps before we get into that, I might just very quickly explain what the main arguments are in favor of free trade, for and against really are. So, as you know, most economists support global trade. They do so because they argue that it's a very important driver of economic growth, of productivity, and of higher living standards. They argue that trade provides consumers with a wider range of better quality products at lower prices, and that trade helps to allocate the resources of a country in the most efficient and productive manner possible, particularly through the principle of comparative advantage. Now, it's really important to understand the principle of comparative advantage if you want to understand why people are saying that trade is a good thing. Now, of course, many people will argue against that, and they will say that global trade is on balance negative. They say that despite the theoretical benefits that economists point to, in practice, trade delivers inequalities, creating clear winners and losers, both within and between societies. Poor countries often worry that richer countries have inherent advantages, things like economies of scale, access to finance, infrastructure, technology, and expertise that make it difficult for them to compete, with richer countries. On the other hand, a lot of rich countries are concerned that free trade will enable poorer countries to undercut them with lower labor costs and fewer environmental and other standards and regulations. In other words, it will reward countries that pay their workers less and have less concern for the environment. So which of these is true? It's fair to say that both sides can produce evidence to support their arguments, and you can make a case either way. But New Zealand decided in the mid-1980s, at a time when we were one of the most protected economies in the world, that in fact free trade was inherently good for us. And we undertook a series of major reforms that were based on the belief that committing ourselves to free trade was in our best long-term interests. In a few short years, New Zealand abandoned an extensive system of agricultural subsidies. We removed unilaterally, so by ourselves, most of our industrial tariffs, and we effectively opened our economy to the world. It was quite a controversial thing to do at the time, but we did so for several reasons. The first, and the easiest to understand, is we ran out of money. We just couldn't afford the trade policies that we had before, particularly the very generous subsidies that we were paying some of our producers. But these changes were also driven by a belief that as a small, isolated country that was heavily dependent on imports for most things that we used and bought every day, and on exports for our long-term growth, more open trade policies at home and abroad were in our best interests. In the short term, these reforms seem to many to be an example of not what to do. We changed our policies completely and extensively almost overnight. And the removal of subsidies and tariffs had a devastating impact on some of our producers. Whole industries disappeared almost overnight. This led to a very real human cost in terms of short-term unemployment and rising poverty. And in fact, we continue to live with some of these impacts today. Longer term, however, these reforms have generally been regarded as a success. They are seen as having laid the foundations for a very long period of sustained economic growth that we've enjoyed for the last 25 years. And it's led to an unprecedented strength and resilience in the face of external economic shocks. Crucially, our domestic reforms were supported by important developments at the global level. Specifically, the formulation and extension of global trade rules through the WTO. And this was backed by us negotiating a lot of individual free trade agreements, or FTAs. New Zealand has been a strong supporter of the WTO and an active participant in its discussions. And this is very important because the reason that we've done that is because we believe that clear, transparent, and fair trade rules benefit everyone. And in particular, they disproportionately benefit small and vulnerable countries. That's because the absence of global trade rules does not mean the absence of global trade. Global trade has always existed and will always continue to exist. But what it does mean is that where there are no rules that have been agreed and negotiated by everyone, the largest and the most powerful countries are free to set the terms of global trade in a way that is most favorable to them and their interests. And they can change them at will, because effectively they have all of the power and the leverage in individual discussions. We believe that rules are the friend of the small and the weak, and that the multilateral system for agreeing rules provides small countries with an opportunity to influence those rules in ways that they cannot achieve any other way. So New Zealand has invested heavily in negotiating trade rules. We believe that well-designed trade rules and disciplines can actually be a force for good, and not just in terms of supporting economic growth. And I'd like to give you a couple of examples that perhaps not a lot of people talk about as much as they should. First of all, and this is an issue that's very important for New Zealand, because New Zealand is one of the only developed countries that relies primarily on agriculture for its exports. For years, agricultural trade policies in the richest countries have had a devastating impact on farmers in the poorest countries. Subsidies encouraging overproduction would depress global prices for many products. And when these subsidies resulted in artificial surpluses, rich countries would often then subsidize the export of those products into global markets. The result was that the global price of products that poor countries were trying to produce would be so low that many farmers in the poorest countries simply could not make a living. So the WTO played a central role in forcing countries that were carrying out these practices to reform them. It didn't require them to get rid of subsidies, but it required them to design their subsidies in a way that did far less damage to other countries, and in particular to the poorest countries in the world. New Zealand has also been a strong advocate of trade policies that support the environment. And we sincerely believe that well-designed trade policies can support environmental objectives. I'd like to give you a couple of examples in this regard. A key way of doing so is by tackling subsidies paid by governments that have serious negative impacts on the environment. These include subsidies that promote heavy overfishing of scarce global fish stocks, and subsidies that encourage the consumption of fossil fuels. It's shocking to reflect on the fact that subsidies to the global fishing industry are estimated to be in excess of $35 billion every year. And around $20 billion of those directly support overfishing. As a result of us paying our fishermen to catch more fish than they should, more than a third of all global fish stocks are in danger of collapse. So if we continue at this rate, those fish stocks will collapse and there will be no fish in the future. This is a direct result of us paying our fishermen to fish more than they need to and more than they can sustain. For a region like the Pacific, where I'm from, there are many countries where fisheries are their only natural resources, in effect. And they're almost their only source of protein in their diets. So for us, these subsidies are not just unacceptable, they're deeply immoral, and they put at risk many vulnerable communities around the world. It's also really shocking to reflect on the fact that more than $500 billion every year are spent by governments to encourage the production and the consumption of fossil fuels. So that's gas, petrol, and coal. So we spend $600 billion a year paying people to pollute. It's estimated that if we were to remove these subsidies, by that act alone, we would reduce national greenhouse gas emissions by more than 10%. So this is where trade rules, and particularly what they call trade disciplines, are really important. By putting restrictions on how you use certain trade policy tools, particularly those with extremely harmful effects, you can actually have very positive environmental outcomes by creating the right incentives between fossil fuels and renewable energy, for instance, or between sustainable fisheries or between overfishing. Another example that New Zealand has been promoting this year in our role as the chair of APEC, which is an organization in the Asia Pacific dedicated to supporting sensible trade policies, has been in promoting reforms to enable access to vaccines, medicines, and other essential equipment, and to make sure that this equipment can cross borders as quickly as possible and get to those who most need it. We've done this by ensuring that countries remove unnecessary tariffs that they're putting on products that they desperately need, and by helping them ensure that these products can cross borders as quickly as possible. We've also introduced agreements from those countries that are the most powerful in terms of producing these products, that they will not prohibit the export of them. I should apologize. My dog in the background is howling because he can hear me in this room talking to you, and he wants to come and join me. So if you hear a strange noise, that's my dog. If you want an example of why this is so important and how trade can actually be a force for good, I'll give you the example of the Pfizer vaccine, which most of you have probably received. The Pfizer vaccine, which was developed in less than a year and administered to millions of people around the globe, probably saving, hundreds of thousands of lives, is the product of more than 280 components that are sourced from at least 18 countries. Quite simply, this vaccine and many other products like it in our everyday lives could not exist in its current form without trade. But we need to make sure that we use fair and sensible trade rules to ensure that it reaches those who need it most. And in this regard, you'll know at the moment there is a very serious conversation happening in the WTO in Geneva about how you can relax intellectual property rules to ensure that production of this can be made in a way that the poorest people in the world can get access to that vaccine. So in summary then, and I promise I'm almost finished, New Zealand believes that it really makes little sense to ask whether trade is good or bad. Trade just is. It exists, it's necessary, and it's inevitable. But it's in all of our interests to ensure that it's governed by clear, transparent, and fair rules, because we believe that good rules make for good trade. So that's really my prepared comments. I'd really like now to have a chance to talk to you about your views on that, whether you support that or if you have different views. I'd also be very interested in any other questions you have about New Zealand or about New Zealand trade or foreign policy.
So thank you, Ambassador. So now the question and answer session is open. If someone has a question to ask, yes, please.
Hello, Ambassador. Thank you so much for your speech. My name is Joaquina Ibelina. I'm coming from Russia. I'm the second year student of Global Governance program of University Tor Vergata. And I have two questions. First one is, what are the incentives we could implement to make a country which mostly relies on exports of gas and petrol to support environmental objectives? Russia is like one of the examples of export of gas. And the second question is, when you said that New Zealand started implementing removed the industrial tariffs and started this transformation towards more open trade policy, you faced a problem coming from the short term, in the short term period. regarding the unemployment and poverty. How did you overcome it and led to the long-term sustainability? Thank you very much.
Thank you. Well, maybe I'll answer that question very quickly. They're two very good questions, by the way. And then I don't know what's easier for you. We could maybe group some of the questions if there are more as well. But on your first question, it's a really good question, and it's a very tough question for many countries that are relying on fossil fuels. I think the main thing is that you have a clear plan based on clear incentives. Because I think fossil fuels are not simply going to disappear overnight, and it's not fair for communities that are reliant on fossil fuels to just simply expect them to shut down their industries overnight. But what you do need is to create the right incentives, very clear and strong incentives to invest in actions that will lead to investments that will reduce emissions. That might be by more efficient production and use of fossil fuels. It might be in new technologies that can capture some of the harmful effects of fossil fuels. And you may have heard of the technologies around carbon capture and storage, which effectively tries to catch the carbon dioxide that comes from fossil fuels before it can go into the atmosphere and prevent it polluting. And you need to provide those countries and those communities with a means of transitioning to other forms of cleaner production. That might mean in the short term from petrol to gas, and then from gas to other means. But the important thing is that you create the right incentives so that, and you give people clear, predictable environments in which they can make decisions that will be good for the environment. One of the most important means of doing this globally has been the carbon trading concept. So carbon trading operates in two ways to support the environment. One is that it puts a price on pollution. And so it means that you pay more the more you pollute, and it creates an incentive to reduce the amount of polluting you're doing. It also means that countries that need to buy credits for their polluting that they cannot reduce can get those by investing in supporting other countries becoming more environmentally friendly. So that's one mechanism, both at the national and the global level, that is used to try and create the right incentives for businesses and for governments to really invest heavily in, because that's what it takes. And it takes spending a lot of money to change the way we produce energy as much as anything else. And so you need to give the right signals to industries and to governments about the right things to do and make sense for them to do so. In terms of how we dealt with the impacts of our reforms, I should say most people in New Zealand now do not believe that the reforms were wrong, but we do believe that they were handled badly, because effectively we did not manage the transition from a heavily protected society to a completely unprotected society very well at all. It happened very quickly with very little support, and we could have done it in a much kinder way than we did, because transitions are not easy. Transitions mean people losing jobs, in effect, and sometimes that's inevitable, and you have to accept that. But you also need to think about how you can help people who are working in industries that are not competitive to adjust, to gain new skills, to find new jobs in areas that are more sustainable. And that really is something we didn't do very well at all. So I think if we could have a chance again, we would do it a bit differently. We would do it a bit more slowly. We would do it in a way which enabled people to adjust, both businesses and workers to adjust, and didn't quite have the very serious economic impacts that we had at the time. We had very few options at the time because we really ran out of money. We almost went bankrupt in the mid 80s, and that's what drove this very strong reform agenda. but I still think we could have done it better. And I think that's the big lesson, that the reforms can work and they can be very helpful, but you have to do it in a way which is humane and which helps those who need to adjust to do so in a way which means that they have a future.
Thanks very much. So the next question.
Hello, Your Excellency. Thank you very much for your speech. I really enjoyed it. I'm Rania Al-Sarakibi from the University of Tor Vergata, second year Global Governance. Your Excellency, I enjoyed your talk about trade, economics. However, I'm a student majoring in political science and international relations. And therefore, I would like to ask you regarding the recent events that happened in the Asia-Pacific region. So we've seen we've all heard of the deal, the submarine deal between the US and Australia, and sort of the tension that's brewing in the Asia-Pacific region. We're seeing that the area is warming up a bit. However, New Zealand has quite a passive position, in my opinion, regarding the whole matter. We didn't see it maybe join the US, UK, Australia group so far. So I'd like to ask you if you could perhaps elaborate on New Zealand's position when it comes to the relations between maybe China and the West. And could we see maybe New Zealand playing the role of the mediator in any future conflicts? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I knew someone would ask me about this because it is a very topical issue. It's a really good question. First of all, I would say about that deal, a lot has been said about that deal, but I think it's really important to say what that deal is. It's not a defense pact. It's not an alliance as such. It's primarily a deal that is focused on military capabilities. That's effectively what it is. It's about defense procurement and capability development. Both the US and the UK and Australia, they're already allies. They already have collective security agreements between them, and they've had that for years. This is really about defense capabilities. There's a very good reason why New Zealand is not a member of this particular agreement. You may or may not know that New Zealand, Australia is our closest defense partner, and it's a very, very important partner for us. It's not for us ultimately to say what they should and shouldn't purchase, because we are very strong partners of theirs, and we benefit from their military capabilities as an ally. And so, it's not for us to say whether what they did was right or wrong from that perspective. But what I would say is that it's not an agreement that New Zealand would ever expect to be invited to join, for one very good reason. That is, New Zealand is a nuclear-free country. We have legislation in place, and we have done since the 1980s, which says not only do we ban nuclear weapons on our territory, we ban nuclear-powered vessels on our territory. So we have not had any nuclear-powered vessels enter New Zealand since the mid-80s. That means that we could never participate, even with very good friends like the Australia, in a deal on the acquisition of nuclear submarines. Quite frankly, under our current legislation, nuclear submarines, whoever they're owned by, including Australia, could not enter New Zealand waters. That's just part of our legislation. So that's one very good reason why we have not been involved in that. It's not to say that we will not cooperate with Australia or others on defence capabilities in the future, because we have a long history of doing that. But on this occasion, there was no particular reason for us to be involved. You raise a really good point around this deal. What we as New Zealand do not want to see is this feeding into instability or tensions in our region. To be frank, tensions have increased in recent years in a way which is really unhelpful and at times potentially quite dangerous. And we all have an interest in making sure that those tensions are very carefully managed. So we certainly do not want to see this turning into a situation that increases tensions either between Australia and other countries in the region, particularly China, or that increases tensions indeed with other friends outside the region, such as France, who, as you know, was not very happy with this outcome. to do that, I think we have to be really, really clear again what this is and what this isn't. This is not a military alliance. It is not an alliance which is being set up around any particular country. It is about military capabilities. And it's about, in this instance, a very specific military capability that, that is being granted to Australia by two of its closest allies. And it's really important, I think, to focus on that, because that's not how it's necessarily been portrayed, and it's not necessarily how it's been felt in some quarters. And I think I agree, I think probably New Zealand, but other countries in the region too, have a role in making sure that we keep some perspective around this, that we don't let tensions arise from this that will unnecessarily make our region more dangerous than it currently is. I hope that's, I'm not sure if that's answered your question, but I hope so.
Thank you much, Ambassador. Now we have another question for you.
Good morning. I am Nicoletta Bozzo from Italy. I'm a second-year student at Global Governance from Tor Vergata University. And New Zealand's Maori Party launched a petition to change the official name of the country from New Zealand to Aotearoa. Excuse me if I may mispronounce this, and to restore the Maori names for all towns, cities, and place names. Could you please give us some insights regarding this debate? And also, if you could please explain us better, which is the equilibrium balancing this multicultural society? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a really good question. Well, New Zealand, it's probably best if I give you a little bit of context about New Zealand. We are unique in some ways in our colonial experience because New Zealand was created, unlike I think any other country, by a treaty between the indigenous population, the Māori, and the settler community. So in 1840, there was a treaty signed called the Treaty of Waitangi, which today is still regarded as the central founding document of our nation. So it's effectively the basis on which European settlement occurred in New Zealand, and the principles of the treaty continue to be recognized as central to all aspects of New Zealand policy. Now, it hasn't always been quite so well recognized, but in the last 30 or 40 years, that has become central to all policy in New Zealand. This has been accompanied by a very strong resurgence in Māori culture and Māori language. We now have dedicated Māori television and radio stations, dedicated schools that are taught in Māori. Māori is one of the official languages of New Zealand. And even without this petition by the Māori Party, for the last 30 or 40 years, there has been a trend away from European names for places and towards Māori names. So this petition is not particularly radical, to be honest. If you listen to the radio in New Zealand, the announcers will normally start with a few sentences in Māori. Every child in New Zealand will learn some Māori at school, not necessarily fluently in all cases, but every child will know some. Māori culture has become a part of mainstream culture. And many people already call Aotearoa, New Zealand Aotearoa, which has always been the Māori name for New Zealand. So it's not a particularly radical proposition. I should say that there are differing views in New Zealand on this. Obviously, most Māori are very supportive of this. And most young Europeans and other ethnicities are also very supportive of this. The older generation, perhaps, that did not grow up with such a strong influence of Māori culture, sometimes find it a little bit more difficult. And they don't know Māori very well, and they sometimes feel uncomfortable about it. But I think in 5-10 years, even without this petition, you would have many people calling New Zealand Aotearoa, because there has been a real embrace by many New Zealanders, especially young people, that Māori culture, regardless of their ethnicity, is part of them and part of their identity too. So, yeah, I mean, my ministry at the moment normally starts any message with Aotearoa in New Zealand, rather than just New Zealand. That's just part of part of how we communicate internally for ourselves. If you come to an event at the embassy, we will always start with Māori protocol. We will start with a song and a greeting in Māori, in line with traditional Māori protocol. So it is very much part of who we are. So I think it's the future, to be honest.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. So we have another question.
Good morning, Ambassador. I'm Lucrezia Vittoria Natale from Italy. And my question is, the Council of the European Union authorized opening negotiations for a trade agreement between the EU and New Zealand on the 22nd of May 2018, aiming at a sustainable growth and reducing barriers to trade. What is the current state of these negotiations and how do you think they will develop? Thank you.
Thank you. That's a very good question. One that I'm paid to talk about a lot, actually. So we launched negotiations, as you say, in I think in June 2018 was the first round of talks. I think then Trade Commissioner Cecilia Malmström came to New Zealand for the official launch, and we've actually made very good progress. FTAs are very hard, complex things to negotiate, and very politically sensitive, but we are very close to concluding, I believe, and I think it's possible that we could conclude before the end of the year, at least agree in principle, even if all of the individual details of the text may take longer. But one thing to note about negotiations is that the first 90% of an agreement is the easy 90%, because you agree on all the things you can agree on first, and the last 1% of an agreement can take a lot longer than the previous 99%, because you always end up with the hard things at the end, the things that both sides find it hard to agree to. So I'm hopeful that there could be a deal before the end of the year, but it really depends. It really depends if both sides feel that they are getting what they need from the negotiations. So from the European side, for instance, one of the things that your governments are asking for is the introduction of a system of geographical indications. Now, New Zealand has never had a system of geographical indications. And in fact, we find the idea quite strange. It's not something that really has ever existed as a concept in New Zealand. But we know that we cannot agree a deal, particularly with countries like Italy, without providing some protection of concepts like Parmigiano Reggiano or Gorgonzola or Prosecco. So we are going to have to make some difficult concessions on that. Similarly for us, we need to see some things from the negotiations that are actually normally very hard to get from the European Union, and in particular, agricultural market access. Now, we're not a big country. We're not a country that, compared to Europe, produces a lot of agricultural products, but we produce some of them pretty well. And that is always a very sensitive topic. So we both know that we're going to have to make some concessions there. One thing I would say, though, is that it's really important that we do conclude this agreement, because New Zealand and the European Union are about as close on values and on our view of the world as any countries could be. We really are very, very close on so many issues, and we cooperate in so many issues. And the only area we don't, that we are far behind our cooperation with other countries, is on trade. So when we started negotiating with the European Union, there were only 5 other countries that were members of the WTO that the EU had not already either started or completed negotiations with. So effectively, both of us had already been agreeing deals with everyone else that we traded with. And we got to a point now where we were effectively discriminating against each other, because there were just a very small number of countries that, including each other, that we hadn't done deals with. And that's just crazy. You know, for 2 countries that are as similar and as such good partners as the European Union and New Zealand, that just seems wrong. But I think that will be addressed fairly soon. And but as I said, those last 1% of issues are the really hard ones. They're the ones that that really never get agreed until the last minute. So fingers crossed that we have a deal by Christmas.
Thanks very much. So we have another question.
Good day, Ambassador. Thank you for your speech. My name is Shanae Wilson. I'm from South Africa. And my question has to do with the fact that, what we've experienced and what I imagine a lot of African countries have experienced is the fact that due to the depreciation of our currency and the fact that economic growth actually sort of has reverted, a lot of people have, and a lot of other countries, specifically first world countries, have decided to pull out their investments or afraid to invest in African countries, obviously because it's a bit tumultuous politically and economically. And so what I want to know is where New Zealand stands on this, and whether New Zealand is planning on creating any future investments or trade deals that could benefit Africa and create potential sustainable economic growth. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. That's a really good but a very complicated question. I think there's a limit to what a country like New Zealand can do, but I think what I would say is that we do. There are a couple of ways in which we try and do this. I mean, our focus, I'll be honest, has tended to be more on the Pacific, because Pacific Island countries are our closest neighbors. They're ones that don't get a lot of attention from others, and so a lot of the good that we try and do in the world tends to be with Pacific Island countries, but we do have some cooperation with African countries and Southeast Asian countries and others. But there's two ways, I think, in which we are trying to contribute. One is making sure that the rules that govern trade are fair for all countries, including the poorest and most vulnerable. And I think in this regard, as I said, we firmly believe that rules are to the benefit of the poor and the vulnerable, because when you don't have rules, what you have, and we've seen some of this in recent years, is big countries doing what they want. That when you don't have rules, you simply don't have anything to hold the large and the powerful countries to account for. When you have rules, you have an ability to influence the content of those rules, and you have an ability to hold countries to those rules. And in the WTO, for instance, you actually have a dispute settlement mechanism that countries like the US and China and others have lost time and again in, because the rules held them to account. So we believe that rules are important, but the key thing that we can all do to support countries like South Africa and others in Africa is make sure that those rules take account of the circumstances of the poorest and the most vulnerable countries. So, for instance, there is a rule that protects intellectual property, as you know, that basically says that patents must be respected for medicines and other things. But there is also a rule that was built in, and this is the kind of things that are needed, that says that when there is a public health emergency, you can suspend those rules because it's in the interest of public health. And there is a major debate underway in Geneva at the moment to say, well, is COVID one of those situations? Would production of vaccines and of medicines be improved, and would access to those vaccines and medicines be improved if we suspended those rules? And it's very possible that we may have an agreement on some kind of deal on that by the end of the year. But I think there's a lot of ways in which we need to be designing trade rules in a way that takes account of the fact that trade in a country like South Africa is not the same as trade in a country like Italy. That actually in a country where you have less access to finance, less flexible labor markets, less infrastructure, trade is harder, and trade is more complicated, and actually you need to have flexibility that takes account of that. So designing trade rules in a way which is fair to the poorest and the most vulnerable is really important. The other thing that we try and do is support countries by building their capacity to trade, so helping them build their institutions that enable them to meet trade rules and to be successful in trade. Because actually, if there is one part of the world that would benefit more from open trade than anyone else, if it was done fairly, it's probably Africa. And I think the big victims of agricultural trade policies over the last 50, 60 years has been Africa, because the potential in Africa, if it was a level playing field, if the rules were truly fair, to be really great agricultural producers is enormous. But you need all sorts of things to be in place for that to happen. You need investment, in infrastructure, you need institutions that can enable you to meet the trade rules, and you need to reduce subsidies and tariffs that make it impossible for you to compete. So that's really fundamental. Dealing with dealing with, in particular, some of the unfairness in agricultural trade policies is the single most important thing the world could do to help African economies grow. They would benefit enormously. So those are the kind of things that we're focused on. As I said, it's in terms of investment, we're not a major outward investor. We do invest, but that's not really something that we can play a big role in. But around those rules and ensuring that they're fair, that's the main thing, I think.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. We have another question.
Good morning. I am Martina Spanti, a second-year student of global governance from Italy. So my question is, who are the professionals New Zealand is looking for in order to improve environmental change? And also, could you please stress out, according to your personal opinion, what could be some concrete actions on both local and international level that New Zealand might carry out in order to foster and achieve positive environmental outcomes? Thank you.
This is a really good question. It's useful probably to tell you some of the challenges that we are facing in New Zealand on the environment. Our biggest challenge in New Zealand on the environment, we have a relatively clean environment. We're very fortunate. We have low levels of pollution generally. Most of our energy, I think about 95% of it, is generated from renewable energy, so wind or hydro. But we have a major challenge, particularly when it comes to climate change. And it's this, that because our economy is so geared towards agriculture, and particularly livestock agriculture, we have half of our emissions, our greenhouse gas emissions in our economy come from agriculture. Now, that's a problem for us, not because we are especially inefficient. I think globally we are some of the more efficient producers of the products that we produce environmentally. But it's such a big share of our emissions, so almost half, that we cannot meet our international climate change targets without major improvements and major reductions in the agricultural sector. So that's a massive challenge for us, because if you have a coal power plant, or you have very inefficient transport systems, you can spend money and you can fix those. For agriculture, you either start producing other things, or you stop producing altogether, or you have to find a way of producing more efficiently. And so that's the challenge that we're facing. If you are a dairy producer, which we are, that requires cows, and cows produce a lot of methane, and that's a very difficult thing to change and improve quickly. So we are really focused on this, and we have been now for about 20 years. And there's two things I would stress in terms of what we're trying to do. One is we have been working very hard, including bringing together researchers from around the world, to try and reduce the amount of emissions that come from agriculture through science, through research, and through investment in technology. So that's finding ways to make sure that cows produce less methane. That could be through breeding certain types of cows. You can give some cows injections that will reduce their methane production. You can give them different food that will produce methane reduction. But we are working with the best researchers all around the world in something called the Global Research Alliance to try and find ways of producing more food with less environmental cost. But the second thing that we're doing, and this is very specific to New Zealand, is that we are soon going to become the first country in the world to put a price on emissions from agriculture. Now, it's something we don't talk about much, but the only sector in the world that no one talks about putting a carbon price on or an emissions price on is agriculture. And this is despite the fact that agriculture and land use account for between 25% and 30% of all emissions. So about a quarter of global emissions. No one is even trying to create incentives to reduce emissions. New Zealand doesn't have the luxury of doing that. because it's half of our emissions, we have to do something. We have to invest heavily in trying to reduce that. And so what we're doing is putting a price similar to what we're doing in other sectors, carbon trading effectively, or methane trading in this instance. Well, we put a price on emissions and we give a strong economic incentives to farmers to find ways to reduce their emissions from production. And I think we're the first country to do this, but I don't think we'll be the last, because you simply cannot ignore 1/4 of global emissions and hope that somehow the emissions picture will improve. You simply have to at some point do something to address that. And so hopefully our experiment over the next 5-10 years will teach us give us some lessons in how you can do that while also not destroying your agricultural sector. And that's the big challenge for us.
Thanks very much, Ambassador. So we have the last question.
Hello, I'm Costanza Covia. I'm a GG second year student from Governance Italy. And I was wondering, since also Italy relies on agriculture, what can Italy learn from New Zealand, and eventually what can New Zealand learn from Italy? Thank you very much.
That's a really good question. And it's actually one of the issues that as ambassador, I spend a lot of time thinking about, because as you say, Italy is one of the strongest agricultural producers and exporters in the world. And it's based on having top quality products that are relatively high cost, but really high quality. And people are willing to pay a premium for that. So I think that's a very good question. I think I am very keen to find ways to get New Zealand and Italian farmers to learn from each other. And that's already happening in some ways. So for instance, in the kiwi fruit industry, a lot of kiwi fruit, as you know, are produced in Italy. The fruit itself originally came from China, but in its current form was developed in New Zealand. So as a commercial fruit, we created it and we named it after ourselves. Kiwis actually means New Zealander. It's what we call ourselves. So the kiwi fruit we kind of named after ourselves. We work really closely with Italian farmers on kiwi fruit because the soil in Italy is so good and farmers are very good. And you grow kiwi fruit at a time in the year when we can't. So 90% of all of the kiwi fruit that our New Zealand company, Zespri, produces, and it's the largest exporter of kiwi fruit in the world, 90% of all of the kiwi fruit it grows overseas, it grows in Italy. To make that work, they've spent a lot of money and a lot of time working with Italian farmers to improve the size, the taste, and the quality of the fruit that they're growing, and to protect them from pests and diseases. And as a result of that, they can then help them sell their fruit in international markets, in China, in America, and elsewhere. So I'd like to find lots of other ways that we can learn from each other. That's bringing our expertise in areas like kiwi fruit and in other areas where we are very strong, together with the things that Italy is very good at. And I think we have a lot to learn from Italy about producing high quality consumer products. Some of your cheeses, your wines, we have a lot to learn from each other in that area. And Italy is the best in the world when it comes to producing these beautifully produced high-end consumer products, which we don't produce a lot of, and we would love to learn how to do that. So I'm looking for an opportunity to take some of your farmers to New Zealand and to bring some of our farmers here to try and learn from each other. One area I think that we can work very closely, and perhaps New Zealand does have something to share, is around what I was talking about before, more sustainable agriculture and finding ways of reducing the environmental impact of agriculture. Because we have invested a huge amount of time and a huge amount of effort, and we are working with, as I said, the best researchers around the world to try and come up with answers to that. And so it's really important that we work with countries like Italy that also want to find answers to this. And so that's a key area I think that we need to work together to solve some very difficult issues there.
So, Ambassador, on behalf of all the students of the second year of Global Governance of the University of Tor Vergata, I would really love to say thank you for being there. We were really honored of having this conversation with you. and we hope to see you soon also maybe in our university. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm so sorry again I couldn't be there in person. I would really have loved to have met you all, but I hope we do have a chance to meet in person at some point. So I'll look for an opportunity to come back at some point so that I can actually join you in the room next time.
Ambassador.
Thank you very much.
Goodbye. So, guys, for whoever is interested of being there for the next event, so in the main room, the appointment is at 2:05, so 2:05. Okay? Thanks very much.
Excuse me. If you like to do any question, if you like to